Hello, welcome. I see this question pop up. Can D&D run a Game of Thrones? Now, A Game of Thrones is the first book in a fantasy series by George R.R. Martin. It's also the name of an HBO series. They both detail the world of Westeros. Westeros is this grimdark, low fantasy setting where narcissistic nobles are always stabbing each other in the back and main characters are dying every time you turn around. There are magic and fantastic elements in Westeros, but they become more and more prominent as the series goes on. I think a better question to ask ourselves is, can you run a D&D campaign in Westeros? And that's the question we're going to talk about today. First, welcome to my channel. I'm John. My goal is to help referees run better OSR games. If that sounds like you, please consider subscribing. In the meantime, thanks for being here. Now, our journey to Westeros is going to take a couple hops. It starts with a look at where alignment came from in the earliest versions of D&D. In original D&D, alignment consisted of three groupings: law or lawful, neutral, and chaos or chaotic. And in the Dungeon Master's Guide in 1977, Gary Gygax gave us an inspirational reading list of all of his sources, including the fantasy works that explored these concepts of alignment, particularly law versus chaos. Three authors in particular stand out. There's Michael Moorcock, who wrote the Elric series, Roger Zelazny, who wrote the Chronicles of Amber, and then Poul Anderson, who wrote Three Hearts and Three Lions. Both Elric and Amber are 1970s works, whereas Three Hearts and Three Lions was first published in the 50s. It became a full-length novel in 1961. And so you could really see that that's the originator of the concept. In Three Hearts and Three Lions, the main character gets hit on the head during World War II, goes unconscious, and he wakes up in medieval France in the body of an epic hero of the time, Ogier the Dane. And Ogier, he features in like the Song of Roland with Bishop Turpin and Charlemagne and Roland, of course. In the story, he's a knight who goes on various quests, essentially protecting law or defending law and opposing the forces of chaos. And we get this very specific definition of law versus chaos. There's this idea that there's an eternal struggle between civilization and the forces of, or the realms of man, I should say. And then these forces from outside that consist of the realms of fairy and giants and trolls, monsters like werewolves, the witches, and the warlocks. And it's very much alignment as different sides between civilization and the forces trying to destroy civilization. Actually, really, Three Hearts and Three Lions, if you're a reader, I recommend checking it out. It features a paladin. People may point back to Arthurian legend and say, aha, that's the origin of the paladin. But here's an example of one in somewhat contemporary fantasy literature. Ogier gets a holy sword at one point. I think one of the more interesting things, if you're familiar with the Dungeons and Dragons troll, like this weird dude with the long, gangly green limbs, the nose, and when you hack off body parts, they continue to fight and wriggle on the ground, and the troll just keeps regenerating. If you're like, hey, where did that come from? Because Norse trolls aren't like that. Tolkien trolls certainly aren't like that. They're big, dopey guys that turn to stone in sunlight. The D&D's weird green regenerating troll comes straight out of Three Hearts and Three Lions. It's one of the boss fights at one point in the novel. So I thought that was really interesting. So this concept of alignment, not necessarily representing ethics or morality, but more cosmic sides between civilization and the forces trying to destroy civilization. It echoes in different instances of D&D. It was in original D&D. It was maintained through the basic and expert sets in the 1980s. And most OSR games these days don't use the more complicated alignment that was in Advanced Dungeons & Dragons that had like lawful evil and lawful good, chaotic evil, etc. They use the simple, lawful, neutral, chaotic view of alignment, which dates back to original D&D and some of these fictional works. One of the books that develops this is actually The Keep on the Borderlands. Now, The Keep on the Borderlands is one of the most influential modules ever published for D&D. It had the highest publishing figures of any D&D module. It showed up in this basic set in 1981, which was a mass market item. There was like 1.5 million of these sold. To put it in perspective, Lost Mine of Phandelver, which was an extremely popular 5e adventure, sold 300,000 copies. So as an introductory adventure, Keep on the Borderlands sold 5 times as many copies, despite the overwhelming popularity of 5th edition. And in the background, and I'll put this up on the screen too, Gary talks about the purpose of the characters and what they're doing going out to the Borderlands. He says, "The realm of mankind is narrow and constricted. Always the forces of chaos press upon its borders, seeking to enslave its populace, rape its riches, and steal its treasures. If it were not for a stout few, many in the realm would indeed fall prey to the evil which surrounds them." And he goes on to develop this theme a little more. The idea that there's kingdoms of man which represent law, and beyond the borderlands of humanity is a realm of chaos. And the light bulb moment for me came when I was watching the HBO series, A Game of Thrones, and Jon Snow and Tarly, I think his name is, go and take the oath of the Night's Watch. Listen to this. They say, "I am the sword in the darkness. I am the watcher on the walls. I am the fire that burns against the cold, the light that brings the dawn, the horn that wakes the sleepers, the shield that guards the realm of men." And when I saw that, I was like, wow. The Night's Watch is basically a lawful order of fighters who they don't have political ties. They don't have any kind of political affiliations. They transcend politics. They defend the realm of man, or the realms of man, from chaos. The wall that the Night's Watch is on is basically a 300-mile keep on the Borderlands. And when I made that connection, I was like, okay, I don't know when I'm going to do it, but when I put a D&D campaign in a Game of Thrones style world in Westeros, this is how I'm going to do it. The wall is the Borderlands, like I said, so everything beyond the wall is a realm of chaos. And that's where you place your D&D style game loop, like your exploration. That's where you put a hex crawl. You populate it with ruins and tombs and old castles and treasures to be found. And you can run a fantastic D&D style game loop in a world like a Game of Thrones or Westeros. In this model, the 7 kingdoms, which are where all these petty narcissistic nobles who are stabbing each other in the back are, they represent the realms of men. It doesn't matter if individuals in the 7 kingdoms are evil or chaotic or don't really stand for civilization. Taken in totality, those represent law, they represent civilization, they represent the realms of man. And everything north of the wall, like I said, it's the Borderlands. It's populated by undead. There's these horrible, like, cold whites up there, the White Walkers. There are these creepy elves, the children of the forest, magic ravens, giants, crazed barbarians. North of the wall's really wild, and it's a great setting for a D&D campaign. The other thing about it, in the books, the wall, it's 300 miles long. There are some 16 to 19 castles and forts along it. At the time of A Game of Thrones, they say only 3 of them are populated by the Night's Watch, which means that there's probably 16 other castles that either have a skeleton crew or available for other uses. You could easily imagine an adventurers guild or a mercenary group making an arrangement with the Night's Watch to use one of those castles as a base of operations. Suddenly that becomes the place where your player characters have a home base where they can, and imagine a West Marches style campaign or a Northern Marches style campaign, right? Where the characters start at a home base, they hex crawl into the north, learning stuff, and then returning to their home base. And then when they need equipment or they want to go carousing, they'd travel south to either major cities or major holds, King's Landing, if you will. Okay, I know you're going to ask the question, but Game of Thrones is all about politics and interacting with these nobles. I think there's a way to work that in and still maintain what Dungeons and Dragons playstyle is. In the series, the White Walkers represent a mythical threat that everyone's forgotten about, and that as the series goes on and it becomes more and more clear that they're a present danger to the realms of man, people in the North and in the Night's Watch are trying to convince the lords and the different rulers of the Seven Kingdoms that this is a real threat to all of us, that it's a threat that should unite all of humanity against the White Walkers. And you can follow that same pattern in your Game of Thrones style campaign. As the players hex crawl and they start to uncover whatever mystery is out there in the realms of chaos, they'd probably want to start taking side treks to some of these rulers' domains, Winterfell, Casterly Rock, Hightower, places like that, to convince the nobles that what they're seeing up there, they need resources and support, and people need to pay attention. And so in this way, the characters could either get indirectly involved with politics, or maybe they're observers, a Rosencrantz and Guildenstern type effect, if you will, while these big clashes of nobles are going on. But I would preserve a D&D style game loop and have the politics off to the side. Hey, one other thing, just a cool little fact about George R.R. Martin. I'm a huge fan of the Grateful Dead. One of the things I love about his series is that he's worked all sorts of Grateful Dead references into a Game of Thrones. And I was at a concert actually where he was a VIP guest. This was down in Mexico, I don't know, 5-6 years ago, with one of the modern incarnations of the band. The Grateful Dead, they're like a 1960s, 1970s psychedelic rock band. They do the song Fire on the Mountain, and instead of playing their typical weird, trippy, psychedelic imagery all over the screens, for George R.R. Martin, they did nothing but Game of Thrones dragons, doing their thing, burning the world. So I thought that was a really neat and a cool little factoid about GRR. He's supposed to be a gamer too. I know that he's run superhero games, and I think I'd read somewhere that Westeros itself was inspired by maybe a GURPS campaign he did at some point in time. Anyway, this is an idea I definitely will pursue at some point. I don't know that I'd actually place it in Westeros per se, but I might create my own sandcrawler, hex crawl setting that uses these factors. Petty competing nobles back in the realms of man, and a Borderlands and a realm of chaos beyond it. And this idea that people aren't paying attention to a rising threat. Seems like a cool setup for a D&D campaign. Anyway, hope you've enjoyed this one. If you're here for Curse of Strahd or you're following that series, I'll get back to it soon with hex crawling through Barovia. Anyway, have a great weekend and see everyone soon. Bye.